As we often say here at All Souls, when we know better, we must do better. So today we are gathered here to know better so that we may leave and do better. Before we really get rolling, there are some folks who we need to say thank you to for making today happen. So Lynn, Ellen, and Allison, can we please recognize you? Thank you so much for bringing this program to fruition. Thank you. And we must also thank the Indiana Humanities Council, who provided a grant and introduced us to Benjamin Clark, today's speaker, so that we could be here. So huge thank you to the generous folks at the Indiana Humanities Council. The impact on the health and quality of life in many of the affected communities in Indianapolis and the sobering reasons behind it are why we're here today. And the topic of today's conversation is the slow violence of environmental racism in Indianapolis. Our speaker is Benjamin J. Clark, a research assistant for the Charles Bantz Fellowship at IU in Indianapolis. He is an activist as well as a sought-after lecturer on the link between racial inequality and health threats created by contaminants. I live on the Near East Side, and my water tastes like I'm licking soil. These are important conversations that we need to have. Ben holds a master's degree from IU Indianapolis and will receive his doctorate this spring. No small feat. My goodness. Wow. Congratulations. Thank you for your research, and thank you for your willingness to share it. I also want to thank all of you for being here on a Sunday. So thank you for being here, and may we leave this space ready to do better. Please welcome the soon-to-be Dr. Benjamin Clark.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you all. Thank you for being here. First of all, I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch, so that is not lost on me, and I appreciate your time. Is it afternoon? Nope, it's not officially afternoon, so I'll say good morning. I'm very glad to be here. Ready to start the slideshow. So the full title of my talk, the long one that everyone tells me is too long, is White Supremacy and the Slow Violence of Environmental Racism. So there are a lot of big, heavy words there. And we will break that down and kind of talk about it to make sure we're all talking about the same thing in a few moments. But first, I want to talk a little bit about myself and kind of how I landed here on this topic. So I'm a graduate student at IUPUI, or soon to be called IUI. I don't know if anyone knows this, but we changed our name, effective this coming fall. So while I was doing my coursework there, I was a grad research assistant at something called the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute. And that's the IAHI in the green circle there. That's a research institute on campus that takes large issues and kind of looks at them from an arts and humanities perspective. So one of the projects that I got involved in when I was a graduate research assistant there is called the Anthropocene Household. And so, has anyone heard this term, the Anthropocene, before? I'm seeing some yeses, some nos. So it's this global concept that humans have had such a profound impact on the Earth's systems, on the Earth's geology, that hypothetically, 10,000 years from now, 1,000,000 years from now, whoever we are as a species or whoever comes after us as a species will look at the stratigraphy, like the soil or the rock horizons, and be able to point to this period we're living in right now and say, that's the Anthropocene, that's the age of humans. And they will be able to do that because they will see all the microplastics, they will be able to see all the radionuclides from atomic bomb testing. They'll be able to point to this period we're living in now, all the carbon, and say that's the age of humans, that's the Anthropocene. Now there's some scholarly disagreement on when it started and what actually to call it. Is it the Anthropocene or is it the Capitalocene? Do we blame capitalism for all of this? Maybe. But I think broadly, people agree Anthropocene is a good enough term to go with this. Some people say it started with anatomically modern humans. Some people say it started with the Industrial Revolution. Some people say it started after World War II with all the atomic testing. So it depends on kind of where you lay in as an academic, as a scholar on the topic, where you think it started. I tend to think it started with the Industrial Revolution when we started burning fossil fuels. That's when we really started to see this profound impact on the Earth, on the planet. Next slide. So this Anthropocene household project kind of takes this global concept of the Anthropocene and flips it upside down and looks at the way this period we're living in, called the Anthropocene, impacts people at the community level, at the household level, at the individual level. So we really want to understand what it's like to be a person in the Anthropocene. So that's the whole idea behind this Anthropocene household project. So part of it is doing qualitative research, which is oral history interviews, focus groups, things of that nature, kind of talking to people and getting their personal narrative about what their experiences are. But another thing we've done, kind of a practical intervention, is to create this free lead testing kit that's very user-friendly. We call it the IKEA of lead testing kits. Has anyone ever put together a bookshelf from IKEA? It's all pictures, right? It's like no words. It's just pictures on how to put the thing together. That's how we wanted it to be. We wanted it to be that easy. Just look at the photo, look at the graphic, and that'll tell you how to do the test. You can test your soil, your dirt outside, your dust, the dust on your bookshelf or whatever, and your water. So these are the three main ways that dust or lead can get into your home, is through dirt, soil, or water and dust. And so what we wanted to do was have this user-friendly lead testing kit that we could give out to people for free, and that would allow them to kind of sidestep the whole health department process, because that could get people into some hot water and some trouble that they can't afford to get out of. So we wanted people to be able to do that anonymously and kind of empower them to take action on their own behalf to fix it. And it's, not typically a super expensive thing to have to fix. If you have lead in your yard, you can maybe cover it with grass seed or mulch, we would tell people, or it's as simple as getting a water filter or an air filter or something like that if you have dust or if the lead's in your water. So that was the idea behind that. That's kind of the practical intervention that the Anthropocene household wanted to give to people to kind of navigate living in the Anthropocene. Next slide. A question about how did the lead get there in the first place? Often, if you live near a lead smelter, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, that's a way that it gets in your yard. But another way, if you notice here, on the side here, the left side, does anyone recognize what this is? It's Indianapolis. It's a redlining map. Has anyone heard of redlining? So it's a neighborhood racial discrimination that started in the 30s and kind of continued into the 60s. And it was a way to kind of assess the mortgage risk of buying in a certain neighborhood. And it was based almost entirely on race, a little bit on social class, but mostly on race. So these redline neighborhoods, you often would find majority black, majority brown, majority immigrant. These were the neighborhoods. This is where these people lived, and this is where they saw the biggest mortgage risk. So why am I talking about this? Well, because these are the areas, these are the parts of town where you have the most environmental contamination, the most pollution, the biggest problems today. So we're still dealing with redlining almost a century after it started. And on the right, I have the highway map. I'm sure everyone recognizes that. You see, if I was more technologically savvy, I could overlay them, and you would see more clearly how it lines up. But over here, you have, right here, you have I-70 running right through, bisecting this red line neighborhood. You have 65 bisecting it north to south. So these interstates came in and just decimated, bisecting these neighborhoods. And so that's an environmental injustice, of course, because highways are toxic. Cars are toxic. And how this relates to lead, if anyone remembers, before we had unleaded gas, we had leaded gas. And so lead particulates would come out of the tailpipes of these cars and settle in these red line neighborhoods that were bisected by the interstate. So that's one major way that people don't often realize is how the lead got into these red line neighborhoods, in these majority black neighborhoods now. So the lead is still there. It doesn't go anywhere. So it's still creating a problem for people. It's still getting into their bloodstream. It's getting into the blood of their children, and that has deep neurological impacts on a growing child. So and it impacts adults as well. All your major organs can be impacted by the presence of lead in your neighborhood, in your home. So next slide. So that was a big part of my graduate school career, was working on that project. But now I've finished my coursework. I'm working on my dissertation now. And so I was able to land a research assistantship with this fellowship for this project called Indy Toxic Heritage. So that's an ongoing project that I'm part of now. And there's our website there on the left. And on the bottom is it's something called an Omeka site. And it's like an online repository we've created to gather people's stories, images, artwork, all these sorts of things, these ways to convey this toxic heritage. And heritage is just simply the stories we like to tell about ourselves, or the stories that we can tell about ourselves. But toxic heritage, you think about what toxic means in front of heritage. It's maybe not something we like to talk about, but it's something we have to talk about. It's the pollution, it's the contamination that's in our lives, in our stories. And so if anyone living in Indianapolis has a toxic heritage story, idea, thought, artwork, whatever they want to share, come up to me afterwards and I'll get you connected. We're trying to collect stories and so forth from as many people as possible. So that's a project I'm a part of now. So that's how I landed here. I've been working on this for the last 5 years or so, trying to deepen my understanding. I was hooked from the beginning. I read an article when I first started grad school about environmental racism, and I was like, I have to know more about this. I have to understand it, and then I have to understand more about the role of white supremacy in causing this. Wow, this is really a big problem. So that's why I'm here today. That's how I landed in front of you. And so thank you for being here to listen to me talk about what I've learned over the last 5 years. Next slide. So let's break down the title. It's big, heavy stuff. So what is white supremacy? Is it waving a Nazi flag? Is it carrying a Confederate banner? It can be. But I think a more helpful way to think about it is as a system. It's a systemic problem. That means white people maintain power and privilege. So there's a story about this author. He was giving a keynote speak at a graduation, the commencement speaker. And he told a story, like an allegory, about two fish who were swimming along. They were kind of young fish. And they came along this elder fish, this elder statesman of fish. And the older fish said, "Hey, how's the water?" And the two fish look at each other, the younger fish, and say, "What's water?" And then they just go on their way. So, if you're following me, if this makes any sense, white supremacy is the water we swim in. So often, as white people, we're not aware of it. We're not aware of how we are the beneficiaries of centuries of systemic white supremacy. And that is a problem, because the system we're living in is built to benefit people with white skin. And on the flip side of that, to not benefit people with dark skin. Next slide. So another concept that I'm talking about when it comes to environmental injustice, environmental racism, is slow violence. Has anyone come across this term before? This is kind of a new one for me. I had to learn about it too. It was coined by this scholar named Dr. Rob Nixon. And it's this idea of this violence that occurs gradually and out of sight. You can't necessarily see it with your eyes. It's not like fast violence, like a gunshot. That's fast violence. Or even if we're talking about the environment and the climate, like a tornado, that would be an act of fast violence. But we're talking about something that takes place over a much longer time scale, right? And it's delayed destruction. dispersed across time and space. That's the way to think about what slow violence is. And now if you think about the connection to environmental racism and environmental injustice, that's the timescales we're talking about. That's why it's such a problem, because it happens over such a long period. Whole generations of people are impacted. Next slide. Environmental racism. You're here because you want to learn about environmental racism. Well, let's get on the same page about what we're talking about. One of the founding fathers of environmental racism as a scholarly pursuit is Dr. Robert Bullard. That's him there. And I always tell people, if you want to learn about environmental racism, read what he wrote. Or if you're reading something about it that doesn't cite Dr. Bullard, put it down and go find something that does, because the man knows what he's talking about. So just kind of a textbook definition is any policy, practice, or directive that has a differential impact on people based on their skin color. That's kind of the bare minimum. That's what we're talking about. Next slide. But what does that look like in reality? Well, I would implore you to become an investigator. When you drive around your neighborhood, when you drive around this city, maybe go somewhere where you don't normally go and just look around and get curious about what you see and who is living there. Because often you have these industrial sites, you have smokestacks, you have incinerators and waste dumps and oil refineries right next to where people are living. These are called fence-line communities. The way people are living right next to where all of this pollution is being put into the air, all of these contaminants are being put into the environment. And so get curious when you drive around, just look around and see what's there and who's living nearby. And you'll start to get kind of a sense of the landscape of environmental justice in your city. And this is not just Indianapolis. So this is everywhere, all over the country, and even in fact all over the world. And I have a map I'll show you in a few moments. Go ahead. Another one of my favorite scholars that I tell people to read, if you want to know about it, is Dr. Laura Pulido. And she's great. She's done a lot of really important work on the impact on Latinx communities in California. She's done some really terrific work. And she's the one who got me thinking about white supremacy as part of the problem when it comes to environmental injustice. And bringing it back to the Anthropocene, she's talking about how she calls it the meta processes, the kind of large overarching processes of the Anthropocene, like industrialization, urbanization, capitalism itself, are contributing to this racial injustice in the way it impacts people's environments. The meta processes follow along racial lines. That's such a key phrase right there. So does that make sense? White supremacy, slow violence, environmental racism, we all kind of are on the same page? Okay, next slide. So Dr. Laura Pulido talks about how environmental racism isn't one thing. It's multiple things. There's not just one environmental racism, it's environmental racisms. And as you can see, I thought the best way to illustrate this would be with a Venn diagram. So we have white supremacy operating over here, white privilege over here, and settler colonialism, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about today, but I'll spend a few moments because I think it's important. And right in the middle, where the Venn diagram, where it all meets, you have environmental racisms. So what does white supremacy look like? Well, one way it can manifest itself as an environmental injustice is in the policies. White supremacy is built into the systems that form our environmental regulations. Does that make sense? So these systems are, and I'll talk about this later, I'll give an example of what I mean, but the way the policies and procedures are designed to benefit white people. And it's not necessarily on purpose, and it's not necessarily because the bureaucrats running these regulatory agencies are bad people. It's just because this is the system, this is the water we swim in. What's water? Well, we're swimming in it. White privilege, what does that look like? I'll give it a concrete example a little bit later, but that's like, has anyone heard of white flight? So white flight is an example of this. In the mid-20th century, you had the suburbs growing, and these kind of white urban, or these urban core of a city like Indianapolis was majority white with some black and brown people living there too. but you had the interstates coming through, you had industry building up in these cities, and you had white people leaving, getting the heck out of Dodge for the suburbs. But because of social pressures that were in place, because of things like redlining, you had these urban cores of cities becoming majority black. So that's an example of white privilege. And settler colonialism, that's another one. That's a whole other talk that I could give. But I want to spend a few moments talking about it just to give you the information. And Plato talks about it as kind of the original sin of this country. We came in as white Europeans and dislodged the Native Americans who were living here, moved them west because they were in our way. They were not taking good care of the land, we thought, and they had to go somewhere else. They had to go to Oklahoma or Kansas and points farther west. So that kind of original taking of the environment from people could be seen as an act of environmental injustice. But next slide. Oh, I forgot about this one. Does anyone recognize where we are in this map? Can you tell? This is Indiana. This is what I'm talking about. This is who the land belonged to before the white Europeans came. Mostly the Miami, the Miamia people, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, the Kickapoo. These are the folks who lived here and were moved west as the white Europeans came in and settled. This is people being removed from their home environment and moved somewhere else that's completely unfamiliar. Next slide. So what happens, just kind of to drill down a little bit, one example is something this gentleman talks about, Dr. Kyle White, is food injustice. So you have these, like the Miamia people, for example, maize, corn, was a huge part of their culture. The rivers, the fish that they got out of the rivers here in Indiana, the Tippecanoe, were hugely part of their culture. And you remove people from their known environment where they know the rivers well, they know how to grow corn here, and put them in Oklahoma, that's a completely foreign environment. You're creating a food injustice that way. Next slide. So that's just one kind of really specific example. And this is another one that's kind of more in the modern period, more in the present. We're still dealing with this, is uranium mining. The Navajo folks out in the Southwest, apparently this area was known to have a lot of uranium. And so during the Cold War, when we were building all these atomic bombs, this area was taken over by the federal government and all these mining companies who wanted to mine it for uranium. And who did they draft to work there? The Navajo, because it's right in the middle of the reservations, as you can see on the map. And so these people were called upon to work for cheap wages because they were desperate for a job. And so, they were getting uranium all over their clothes and going home to their children and getting their kids sick this way. This is an environmental injustice that's happening because there was very little care or consideration for the lives of the Navajo people in the midst of these reservations. They just came in and got their uranium, and then once the Cold War ended, they kind of pulled up stakes and left town and just left these mines open. And it was in the ponds and in the rivers and the streams, and kids were playing in these places and getting very sick. So this is another example of the impact of settler colonialism on environmental injustice. So I want to move forward and talk a little bit about the environmental justice movement as it got started and how we came to raise our national consciousness about what environmental injustice is. So it all started as a movement in a place called Warren County, North Carolina. And so the story is that in the 70s, the EPA came online during the Nixon administration. We started having a lot more environmental regulations and a lot more consciousness about taking good care of the environment. And so a lot more regulations went in place on companies. They had to dispose of their waste in a much better way for the environment, right? So in North Carolina, you had this company who had waste oil that had to be taken care of. And so instead of disposing of it properly, they decided in the dead of night, I'm not making this up, to just dump it along the highway. Thousands and thousands of gallons, tens of thousands of gallons of this contaminated oil just dumped along the highway in the dead of night. This is crazy to me. And it's polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. So I don't know, I'm not a chemist, I don't know exactly what that means or why it's such a problem, but I know it's not something you want in your environment. It's something that can make you very sick. So they, the solution was to dig up all the dirt along the highway and load it into dump trucks. They had 60,000 tons of this contaminated dirt to get rid of. And so they thought, where are we gonna put it all, right? I have no idea where to put it. Let's put it in Warren County, North Carolina. They're poor, they're black, they're not gonna stand up to us, right? That was the idea, that was the mentality. Boy, were they wrong. I mean, look at this photo. There's more courage in this photo than I've ever had in my entire life. Imagine laying down in the middle of a highway with 60,000 tons of dirt in these dump trucks coming your way, just laying down in the middle of the highway. These children are protesting because they care that much. This dirt with all this PCBs in it coming into their environment where they live, where they play, where they go to church, where they go to school, where they live. And so there was a lot of pushback from the community. People said, we don't want this landfill. It's gonna leak. It's gonna cause a problem. And guess what? They were right. It did. It leaked. It caused a problem. Next slide. But you still had people pushing back, getting arrested on purpose, civil disobedience, these sorts of things. And as I said, the protest was initially not successful, unfortunately. So they put it in the landfill, and of course it did leak, and of course it made people sick. But the good news is that the community was not dissuaded from pursuing justice, from pursuing what they knew was right. So it took about 20 years, and through the 80s and into the 90s. It wasn't until the Clinton administration, which when Clinton came into office, he put into place an executive order that said the federal government needs to take environmental justice into account. And so that's kind of the turning point. That's not exactly what happened here. It wasn't exactly that executive order that did it, but it was a mentality shift at the federal level that said we need to start thinking about this stuff. Let's listen to the people in Warren County, North Carolina. They know what they're talking about. Let's pay attention to this problem. Let's fix it. And so that kind of trickled down to the state and municipal level, and everybody got together and they took care of the landfill. They fixed it. They moved it somewhere else. And so it's a happy ending. By 2004, the area was considered clean of PCBs. So it was ultimately successful. But meanwhile, you have this 20-year period where people are living in this contaminated environment. And that's an act of slow violence in itself. That's a generation of people who grew up in this contaminated environment. So it's still a problem, but next slide. Another success of this moment, this Warren County, North Carolina moment, is a rising national consciousness of environmental racism. And that's where you first get the term environmental racism. It was coined by this man, Reverend Ben Chavis. He was an activist. You can see him there. He's part of the protest in Warren County. And he was the one who said, let's call this environmental racism. Let's call it what it is. And so he coined the term. And a few years later, he was drafted by an organization to do a report on environmental justice nationwide. And so in 1987, he and the group he led published this report called Toxic Wastes and Race. And this was the first time, this is a huge turning point, this was the first time in print that we can see a direct correlation between race and class and environmental quality. So the report concluded race is the biggest predictor that someone will live in a polluted environment. This was the first time that we were able to really say, we have the data on this. This is a nationwide problem. And so this is what came out of the struggle in Warren County, North Carolina, this Toxic Waste and Race report. And it's been updated. It was updated 20 years on, and it still found it to be true. But what it did was it raised a national consciousness about this problem. in other communities around the country, you see start to say, yeah, we have this problem too. Let's stand up for ourselves and do something about this. And so you have this rising activism too when it came to environmental justice. Next slide. So where's the EJ movement today? Where's the environmental justice movement today? Well, I think we can look on the horizon and see climate justice as a problem. Environmental justice and climate justice go hand in hand, for sure. You have these rising sea levels, and who's being most impacted by it? Poor, not white people living on coastal communities and so forth. And also, water quality. Flint, Michigan. We've all heard of Flint, Michigan and the problem there. That's a problem. I mentioned earlier settler colonialism and environmental justice. We have Standing Rock in the Dakota Access Pipeline. Does this ring a bell for people? Yeah, that's another issue that's still on the horizon that we're still kind of thinking about and dealing with is water rights and water quality and rights to our own land. So that's another environmental justice issue that I think we're still dealing with today and will be for some time. Next slide. And I mentioned climate justice as another thing on the horizon. If it's not already here, I mean, let's be real. I think we're kind of already there. Not to be too grim, but I think that's the fact of the matter. Next. And I mentioned this map. Environmental justice isn't just an Indiana problem. It isn't just a United States problem. It's a worldwide problem. This is a research project by Dr. Alice Ma. She's a great scholar on environmental justice. There are a lot of them out there, but she's one of the best ones. And she's doing this project that's mapping all these environmental justice communities around the globe. Really important work. Next slide. So an example of environmental justice that I want to talk about, environmental injustice, is something called Cancer Alley. Has anyone heard of this? There's this great video on YouTube. It's called What It's Like to Live in Cancer Alley. It's about 10 minutes long, and if you're interested in the topic, I definitely recommend watching it. But it's this 85-mile corridor where you have about 150 petrochemical plants all along this 85-mile corridor, and you have these fence-line communities, and guess who lives there? Mostly black people. You can see in this photo on the bottom right how close the oil refineries are to where people live. I mentioned fence-line communities. That's what I mean. I mean, that's very close to your home. Could you imagine living there? So this is a big problem. A lot of people get sick, and it's no coincidence it's called Cancer Alley, right? A lot of people there get cancer. In the video I mentioned, the fight there for justice is led by this man, General Russell Honore. He's a retired Army general, and he's leading the fight there for environmental justice. And he talks about how he's trying to think of people he knows who didn't die from cancer. Can you imagine? I mean, that's really grim. A lot of people getting very sick. And in the video, he also says, the big oil has hijacked our democracy. It's not democracy anymore. It's just people, the government's responding to the interests of big oil, is basically what he says. Next slide. And that's basically what Betty Bickham says as well. The government doesn't care about us. They don't have our back. Could you imagine that feeling? How scary that would be to think the government does not have my back. I'm here alone. It's just me and my community against big oil. Could you imagine taking on that billion-dollar industry, multiple billion-dollar industry? How frightening that would be. So Cancer Alley is another example, a very vivid example of environmental injustice. So I want to talk about a couple of local examples. We have the Riverside Groundwater Contamination Site. It also goes by another name, much more bureaucratic sounding name, Site 0153. If anyone's heard of this, it's been in the papers. So I mostly refer to it as 0153 because it's a lot faster than saying Riverside Groundwater Contamination Site. But have folks heard of Riverside, this neighborhood in Indy? There's a great city park there. It's been a predominantly African-American neighborhood for since the middle of the 20th century. Before then, it was kind of a majority white and then a mixed neighborhood, then a majority black neighborhood during kind of the period of white flight that I mentioned. And it's near Indiana Avenue. If you know about Indiana Avenue, kind of the center of black cultural life in the 20th century, kind of a big deal. This is the residential area just up from where Indiana Avenue was. And so the groundwater contamination site got there because mostly from dry cleaners. Next slide. So this is a map showing where all the locations are where they found sources for the groundwater contamination and all the chemical names, and I'm not going to even try to pronounce them. But you can see it's chlorinated solvents and volatile organic compounds. This is what gets into the environment when you have dry cleaners just dumping their chemicals into the alley, which we know anecdotally and we know from other sort of data that this is how they disposed of their chemicals, which is a big problem, right? And so it's called Riverside for a reason. It's right beside a river. And so these chemicals, these chlorinated solvents, these volatile organic compounds leached into the ground. There's an aquifer, an underground kind of water area, and it's connected to the river. So the chemicals leached into the ground, and now it ended up in the drinking water. Next slide. But an even bigger problem is, well, the finished water coming out. It wasn't the raw water. The raw water had all these contaminants in it, but the finished water was still coming out clean. So why is this a problem? Well, this oral history interview that one of my colleagues did, I think really illustrates it well. He's talking about vapor intrusion, which is not something that I was aware of as a thing, but now I know it's a thing. You have this contaminated aquifer, and you have these chemicals leaching into your home from the ground. You don't even know it's there, but you're being made sick by these chemicals. And this was happening for decades in Riverside. And why is this an act of slow violence? Well, because it happened over a long period, over many decades, but also kind of in the way the bureaucratic processes acted out. Citizens Water found out in 2013 through water testing that this was happening. They let IDEM, Indiana Department of Environmental Management, they let them know right away. And anyone know how long it took IDEM to go out there? More than a year. More than a year. And IDEM is just down the street. And I'm not throwing people under the bus at IDEM. They're all regular bureaucrats. It's fine. But what systems are in place? What have I been talking about? What systems are in place? What policies, what procedures are in place that did not compel them to go out there right away? These people are living in this contaminated environment, and we're just going to sit here a quarter mile away from Riverside and not go out there and do water testing and get the process rolling. This is slow violence. This is slow violence written into the policies and procedures of our government. Next slide. And so another thing that happened, that there was a debate over whether this should be a Superfund site, which everyone knows what a Superfund is. It's where you get EPA money, big money, to mitigate a site. Or, on the other hand, should it be run by IDEM, the Department of Environmental Management? Should it be state funded to clean it up? And so there's this big debate, and it turned out that most people in the community and a lot of the investors, the redevelopers in the area, didn't want it to be a Superfund site. They didn't want to carry that label. And there's good reason. Who would want to live in a Superfund site? I get it. But also, it slowed down. It slowed down the whole process to have this debate and to have IDEM run the cleanup process. And it is significantly less funding to actually carry out the mitigation, to have IDEM run it rather than the EPA. As I said, big money with the federal government. And all behind that is this idea of people not wanting their development dollars to go away. There's this big development there called 16 Tech. It's this urban innovation district or whatever. And people didn't want that investment to go away in the area. And this is where you start to see kind of gentrification creeping in and the relationship between environmental injustice and gentrification. You have these cheaper areas. They come in and get redeveloped. Why are they cheaper? Well, because they're contaminated, but now people can come in and gentrify the area and displace people, make it unaffordable for the people who live there. But meanwhile, in the background, IDEM is running the cleanup, and things are going relatively well, but it's more than 10 years. Half a generation has gone by, and they're still kind of dealing with the cleanup there. These volatile organic compounds are still in the environment. Now, fortunately, kind of the levels are diminishing over time. But again, it takes time. And people are living out their lives. They're at home, they're at church, they're at school, whatever, in these polluted, contaminated environments. Martindale Brightwood. People familiar with this part of town? So I mentioned lead. This is an example of white privilege. This is an area where a lot of white people lived up until the mid-20th century, and then you had white flight that we've already talked about. And so it became a majority black area. And around this same time, at mid-20th century, you had a lead smelter come in and begin operating there. They were recycling lead from like car batteries and stuff, so they can reuse the lead. Which, I believe in recycling, but this is a very dangerous thing to do right where people live. Not something I would recommend. But this is a fence line community, Martindale Brightwood, living right next to this lead smelter. So it operated for 20 odd years, from the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. And then the lead smelting company, U.S. Lead, American Lead Company, I think they were called, American Lead, just left town. They were done. And about 5 years later, in the early 70s, the factory caught fire and burned to the ground, and nobody did anything about it. I mean, they put out the fire, but they didn't clean up the area. The state knew, the city knew, the federal government even knew, but they didn't do anything about it. They knew the lead was there. They knew it was a problem. They knew it was probably in the environment, the yard, the dirt, the soil, where people lived nearby. But they didn't do anything about it for decades. Next slide. Until this woman came along, Elizabeth Gore. Does that name ring a bell for anybody? She ran for the school board. So you saw her name all over town on little signs. But she also worked very hard to form this environmental justice collaborative group in Martindale Brightwood. She's still the leader. But maybe about 20 years ago, the church she attended wanted to expand, wanted to add on to their building. And so just as a matter of course, they did some soil testing in the area just to make sure it was okay. And they found the lead levels to be like astronomically off the charts high in this area, right? And there's a church, there's a school, there are homes, just really mortifying stuff. And she was talking about how she raised her kids there and just how devastating that was. I was able to do an oral history interview with her about this. And just, I mean, to put yourself in her shoes and to have raised your children there, knowing in hindsight, that you raised them in this lead-contaminated environment would be heartbreaking, would be a really tough thing to deal with. But as you can see, that's what we talked about in her interview. And so she led the charge. She got the pastor involved. She got her neighbors involved, and she pounded the drum saying, you need to do something about this. You need to do something about this. So she got the city, the state, the EPA involved, declared it a Superfund site, freed up that big money to come and fix the area. Next slide. And so the EPA got involved and did mitigation work on hundreds of yards, people's lawns. They just did a wholesale replacement of these people's lawns because they found, and they kept finding, they've done several rounds where they come in and do these lawn replacements. They dig down maybe 2 feet and replace that soil. Could you imagine how much? I couldn't afford to do that in my yard. I know that. So it's a good thing that they declared it a Superfund site because they were able to come in and spend this money and replace these people's lawns, hundreds of them. And now they know they're doing continual testing. It's still kind of an ongoing thing. They still test it. They still want to make sure that it's safe to live there and they don't need to do more mitigation. But this is an example, like I said, of white privilege. white people had the privilege of leaving when the lead smelter was coming in, but the black people who lived there because of social pressures and so forth, redlining and all these sorts of things, had to stay, had to stick around because of, neighborhood segregation and other sorts of racisms that are in the water, had to stay there and live their whole lives in this environmentally polluted area. So, next slide. So what? I've been up here talking, but so what? Why do we care about this? Why does this matter? What should you walk away with? Well, in my opinion, if I can share, is it's a fundamental human right to live in a clean and safe environment, to raise your kids in a clean and safe environment, to live out your life in a clean and safe environment, right? It's a fundamental human right, and that's why we should care. That's the so what, right? Anyone else have a so what? You can shout it out. Anyone else? Why are you here? Why do you care? Yeah, what do we do? Yeah. So what can we do as people? Now that we know better, we do better, right, Reverend Katie? That's right. So one thing we can do, we can get on the phone. We can call our legislators. I've heard, and I can't verify this, but I've heard anecdotally that if a legislator gets more than a few phone calls on one particular topic, they start to panic. So maybe that's a way to kind of get their attention, is to start making phone calls. My wife's so good about this. Anytime there's something happening, my wife will call her representative, call her senator all the time. And they've gotten tired of hearing from her, but I'm so proud of her for doing that. I think it's so smart. So that's one way we can do that. We can't do this alone. I know that. We cannot act alone. We have to act as a group. Everyone who cares about this needs to band together, act collectively, collective action. Like Warren County, North Carolina. That's how they were able to do it. They got together. It wasn't just one person laying down on the highway. It wasn't just one person holding a sign. It was a bunch of people doing it together, right? So that's the answer. Next slide. Everyone asks me what they should read. And these 3 books, I mentioned Dr. Robert Bullard. These other 2 books are terrific. From the Ground Up by Luke Cole and Sheila Foster. Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger by Julie Z. All these are terrific, and all of them are pretty easy to read if you're interested. I do recommend. And just Google Laura Polito. She doesn't have any books, but she has a ton of articles. You can find them for free. So that is all I have for you. Next slide. Thank you. There's my email address. Feel free to reach out if you want to chat or have anything to share or have any questions. But I'm happy to open up the floor. I don't know how we're doing on time, but if folks have questions or comments or derogatory remarks, anything. Yes, sir, in the back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There we go.
I don't know if you can hear any of my rambling or not. But anyway, I do really appreciate this is amazing research. And awareness is definitely the starting point, and then the action to make changes follows. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, and thanks for your comment. Yeah, it's tough to make the kind of policy procedure changes that need to happen because we live, let's just be frank, we live in a state that is designed kind of tilted toward the interests of capital, right? And the interests of doing business, not necessarily the interests for the health and well-being of the citizenry. If we can just be frank about that. So yeah, any other questions, comments? Ma'am.
One, two.
Thank you. Thank you again. I share his opinion as well. But I would suggest that calling people after they've been elected is a good thing, and they might get worried. But I would think we should look at the people who are being elected and pay attention to what they say and do and influence your expectations of them. I find if you can nip it in the bud, we don't have Jerry Torr or several representatives and people, if we're in their district, Senator Adam Freeman, just people that are not helpful to any race or any people or the environment. So
Yeah.
I would say, like, calling after the fact, before, I would hope we could do it before.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a good call. Over here.
Yes, thank you so much.
Sure.
I had a couple questions. I live over on the west side of town, so have seen the development at the AMP, and I think that's that area is one. Oh, is that better? Thank you. And I believe that's a city water supply, and the water utility probably continues to use that aquifer, treats the water, and it's still, we still receive it and ingest it, but it's safe. They make it safe.
Right.
But I think your point was excellent, that the risk to human health are the vapors. And I wondered if you had knowledge about whether IDEM's response focused on that. Somebody was doing something about the risk to ingesting the groundwater. Was anybody doing anything? Did residents get vapor mitigation systems, and did IDEM bring that in? Or I don't know if you have any knowledge of that or not.
From what I can tell, from what I've researched so far, they offered free vapor testing in people's homes, but there was no kind of area-wide effort to address that. But they did offer free testing for folks. But I don't know if people took advantage of that and what they found. But they did find that the contamination in the aquifer has diminished over time. So I think people are maybe somewhat less concerned about it now.
Okay. Actually, now I have two more questions.
Sure.
One. Okay. Okay. I wondered if you had any thoughts about gentrification, and also any thoughts about we live in a world where people sue, and about liability, and I'm thinking about this court case in Montana where children sued that state government. I'm sorry, I cheated. I did take two.
Sure. So gentrification is a problem, and often you see there's a lot of academic research to suggest that you have these environmental justice communities that undergo this mitigation. They get it cleaned up, but they're at rock bottom prices, right? Rock bottom values for real estate. So that's when the developers come in. So you have this, you can almost predict it. You have a process: environmental contamination, mitigation, gentrification. And so you see that in the two communities here locally that I mentioned. Riverside is being gentrified, Martindale Brightwood is being gentrified, and it's a big problem. And I would contend that it's directly related to the environmental problems that they've had because of that kind of predictable process that I mentioned. Yeah.
So in supporting making these changes, what local and statewide organizations would you recommend for us to put our weight behind, our energy behind?
Yeah, there are three organizations that I'm familiar with. I know the people who work there. There's Hoosier Environmental Council. They're a good one. The Kepra Institute, if anyone's heard of this. KHEPRW is how you spell it. And it's Kepra Institute. They're great. They work in Riverside. They do a lot of great activism there. And Earth Charter Indiana is another great organization. They do a lot of education and outreach. Yeah.
Hi, I also want to thank you for your research, and I hope we retain your talent once you get your doctorate in Indiana, because we need people like you. I want to put a plug in for calling your local representative. Picking up the phone and calling our local representatives is hard for a lot of us to get off the couch and actually do, because we don't call strangers a lot these days.
Sure.
Maybe we don't even remember who our local reps are. But I really want to put in a plug that you don't have to be all up on all the research of a topic. You call your representative and say, this is what I care about. I want you to make sure IDEM is funded, or whatever it is you'd like to say. You can speak from your heart. It really, really, really counts. They do pay attention to the phone calls. So everybody in this room, promise me you'll make a note, find a local rep, call them, and just speak from your heart. So don't feel like you have to be an expert.
Thank you.
You can also say thank you to folks like Carrie Hamilton, who are doing environmental justice work at the state level. So they like the thank yous too.
Thank you very much for your work. We
Sure.
appreciate it. I think besides the things that have already been mentioned, there's a lot of identification of people doing things to us or doing things to the environment. But for those of us who have the good fortune of being invested in the market, I mean, it's sort of like you have to follow your heart with what you invest in. So it's like I said, I think it's really important to reflect what you're supporting. We all love to have double-digit returns if we have fortunate enough to be in the market, but it's important to see where your money's going and to really make hard decisions about, what you're going to profit off of. So
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Something to really think about and follow your values. Any other questions or comments?
At the very beginning of your talk, you talked about the free testing that you put together for iron in water, right? Lead water. How do we access that if we know an environment that would benefit from those tests?
Well, that particular project, I'm sad to say, ran out of funding. So I think they still have some tests. You can get on the IHI's website and see if they have any other tests remaining. When I left the program, they still had a lot of tests. And there's another sister program that also was handing out free tests, and you can get those at your local library. Indianapolis Public Library, excuse me, ought to be able to connect you with free lead tests.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
There's the paper today, which maybe we didn't all have an opportunity to read. There's a good article on the Norwood community, which is next to the Coke plant, Coke plant.
Oh yeah.
I grew up, be taken down there to see how it all worked, But the young woman is trying to start a park there, and to have her own parks department. Phyllis Boyd.
Yeah.
The answer she gave this young woman, it was an absolute sneer. We have better plans for it. And she was saying there were historical events, the 28th Colored Infantry after the Civil War settled there. There was perhaps some foraging from Native Americans, the Lenape. But just a decent person. And to hear this response, and part of their plan was to pave it over and not clean it up with all of these compounds. I didn't know if you could speak to that, and were you aware of this? I mean, if the city could build the new court and justice center and get that cleaned up, it's just 14 acres next door practically.
Right.
Please.
Yeah, I haven't seen this article, but I am somewhat familiar with Norwood. The Indy Toxic Heritage Project that I mentioned, we're doing some work in Norwood. We're working with the local community organization there. And I know a thing or two about the Justice Center they put in. Apparently when they went to do the mitigation, do the cleanup, they only had to get it to like industry standards. So safe enough for someone to work an 8-hour shift. But guess what? People are living there 24/7. So these inmates are not being considered in this. So that they're living in this very unsafe environment. So that's just, you know, that's a whole other topic, another form of environmental injustice. But I'll have to read that article and get familiar with what you're talking about. Anyone else? Well, thank you all for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your work and for leading us in a rich congregation. Thank you, Austin, for being on AV. And thank you for all of you who are toughing it out with us as we explore a green solution to our boiler. And, you know, little chilly, but warm hearts and important conversation. Thank you all. Have an amazing Sunday. And thank you again.